The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base as Captain Sarah Viper Rodriguez performed her final pre-flight checks on the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The aircraft, known affectionately as the Warthog, sat like a sleeping giant on the runway. Its distinctive twin engines mounted high on the fuselage and the massive GAU-8 cannon protruding from its nose made it look more like a flying tank than a conventional aircraft. Rodriguez had been flying A-10s for 8 years, and today's mission was supposed to be routine. A training exercise over the Nevada desert, practicing close air support techniques with ground units. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, and all systems showed green across the board. She climbed into the cockpit, the familiar smell of aviation fuel and worn leather greeting her like an old friend. "Tower, Hog 67, requesting taxi clearance for runway 27, she spoke into her headset, using the call sign assigned to her aircraft that day. "Hog 67, cleared to taxi. Wind is calm, visibility 10 miles. Have a good flight out there, Captain." The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spun up with their characteristic whine, and Rodriguez guided the heavily armored aircraft toward the runway. At nearly 30,000 pounds empty weight, the A-10 was never going to win any speed contests, but what it lacked in velocity, it made up for in sheer toughness and firepower. 20 minutes later, she was cruising at 15,000 feet over the stark Nevada landscape. The desert stretched endlessly below, a tapestry of browns and grays, broken only by the occasional road or dry riverbed. Her destination was Range Complex 74, where Army units were conducting live fire exercises. Her job was to provide close air support, coming in low and fast to engage simulated enemy positions with practice rounds. "Hog 67, this is Dust-Off Control. We have your position. Proceed to grid reference 774921 for your first target run." Rodriguez banked the aircraft to the left, feeling the familiar heaviness of the controls. The A-10 was not designed for graceful maneuvering, but for surviving in the most hostile environments imaginable. Every critical system was duplicated. The cockpit was surrounded by a titanium bathtub that could stop small arms fire, and the aircraft could fly with one engine, half a wing, or most of its tail shot away. She spotted the target area below, marked by orange smoke grenades that the ground controllers had deployed. The exercise called for her to make several low-level passes, simulating strafing runs against enemy vehicles and positions. Rodriguez pushed the stick forward, dropping the nose and beginning her descent. At 5,000 feet, she initiated her attack run. The target area grew larger in her windscreen as she dove toward the desert floor. At 2,000 feet, she leveled off and lined up her approach. The heads-up display showed her airspeed at 300 knots, well within parameters for the attack profile. That's when everything went wrong. A sharp bang echoed through the cockpit, followed immediately by a violent shudder that ran through the entire airframe. The aircraft lurched to the right, and Rodriguez felt the stick go mushy in her hands. Warning lights began flashing across the instrument panel like a Christmas tree, and the master caution alarm filled the cockpit with its urgent tone. "Engine fire, right engine," she announced over the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline now coursing through her system. Years of training kicked in as she ran through the emergency procedures burned into her memory. She pulled the fire suppression handle for the right engine and began the shutdown sequence. The fire warning light extinguished, but her problems were far from over. The aircraft was pulling hard to the right, requiring constant left rudder pressure to maintain anything resembling straight flight. A quick glance at the engine instruments confirmed her worst fears. The right engine was completely dead, and oil pressure on the left engine was dropping rapidly. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Hog 67 declaring emergency. Lost right engine, left engine degrading, requesting immediate vector to nearest suitable airfield." "Hog 67, we copy your emergency. Nearest suitable field is Nellis Air Force Base, bearing 090, distance 47 miles. Squawk emergency and state your intentions. Rodriguez dialed 7700 into her transponder, the universal emergency code that would alert every radar facility and aircraft in the area that she was in trouble. 47 miles to Nellis might as well have been 400 with the way the aircraft was handling. The left engine was still running, but the oil pressure gauge continued its relentless descent toward zero. She began a gradual climbing turn toward Nellis, trading altitude for gliding distance in case the remaining engine failed completely. At 12,000 feet, she felt the aircraft shudder again, and the left engine began running rough. The oil pressure warning light joined the chorus of alerts already demanding her attention. "This is getting interesting," she muttered to herself, a habit she'd developed during her years of flying. Talking through problems helped her think, and right now she needed all the mental clarity she could get. The radio crackled to life with a new voice, crisp and professional. "Hog 6-7, this is Viper 1-1. We're a flight of 2 F-16s that just launched from Nellis. We've been directed to provide escort assistance. What's your status?" Rodriguez looked out her left window and spotted 2 sleek F-16 Fighting Falcons climbing up to join her. The sight of the backup was reassuring, even though there wasn't much the fighter pilots could do except relay information and provide moral support. "Viper 1-1, Hog 6-7. I've lost my right engine completely and the left engine is running on borrowed time. Oil pressure is down to minimum limits and I'm getting intermittent engine fire warnings. I'm at 12,000 feet and descending slowly to conserve what power I have left." "Copy that, Hog. We're joining up on your left side now. Nellis is about 30 miles ahead. Weather is clear and they're rolling the emergency equipment as we speak." The lead F-16 slid into formation about 100 feet off her left wing. Rodriguez could see the pilot in the other cockpit, his helmet turning as he visually inspected her aircraft for external damage. The wingman positioned himself slightly higher and behind, providing top cover and maintaining communication with air traffic control. "Hog 6-7, I can see some obvious damage to your right engine area. Looks like you've got some panels missing and what appears to be scorch marks around the engine intake. Your left engine appears intact from what I can see." Rodriguez wasn't surprised by the damage assessment. The engine failure had been violent enough that she'd felt it through the entire aircraft. What concerned her more was the steadily decreasing oil pressure on the remaining engine. The gauge now showed less than 30 pounds per square inch, well below the minimum operating pressure of 40 psi. "Nellis Tower, this is Viper 1-1 escorting emergency aircraft Hog 6-7. Request priority clearance for emergency landing on any available runway." "Viper 1-1 Nellis Tower, we have runway 21 left cleared and standing by. Emergency equipment is in position. Wind is light and variable. Hog 6-7 is cleared for emergency approach any runway." At 15 miles from Nellis, the inevitable happened. The left engine began surging, the RPM fluctuating wildly as the oil pump struggled to circulate what little lubricant remained. Rodriguez felt the power output dropping, and she knew she had only minutes before complete engine failure. "Viper 1-1, I'm losing the left engine now. Power is intermittent. I'm going to try to stretch the glide to the airfield, but it's going to be close." "Roger, Hog. You're looking good for the approach. Nellis is 10 miles ahead, and you've got about 8,000 feet of altitude to work with." The A-10's reputation for surviving battle damage was legendary, but gliding a 30,000-pound aircraft to a dead-stick landing was not something any pilot wanted to experience. Rodriguez began configuring the aircraft for the approach, lowering the landing gear and extending the speed brakes to increase her rate of descent. At 5 miles from the runway, the left engine finally gave up completely. The cockpit fell silent except for the whistle of wind over the airframe and the electronic warnings that continued to demand her attention. She was now flying a very expensive and very heavy glider with only one chance to get the approach right. "Hog 6-7 is flame out both engines. I'm committed to the approach." "Copy, Hog. You're looking good. Runway is 2 miles ahead. Emergency equipment is standing by. Rodriguez focused every ounce of her skill and experience on flying the perfect approach. Too high and she'd overshoot the runway. Too low and she'd come up short in the desert. The A-10's excellent gliding characteristics worked in her favor, but she had no margin for error. The runway threshold passed beneath her at exactly the right altitude and airspeed. She pulled back on the stick to arrest her descent, and the main landing gear touched down with a solid thump on the concrete. She deployed the drag chute and applied wheel brakes, bringing the aircraft to a stop about halfway down the 10,000-foot runway. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft immediately, foam trucks at the ready in case of post-landing fire. Rodriguez shut down all electrical systems and popped the canopy, the desert air rushing in to replace the stale cockpit atmosphere. "Hog 67 is on the ground safe," she reported, her voice betraying the first hint of relief since the emergency began. As she climbed down from the cockpit, the two F-16 pilots who had escorted her in were already taxiing toward her position. The lead pilot, Major Tom Razor Harrison, shut down his engine and climbed down from his aircraft, pulling off his helmet as he walked toward the damaged A-10. "Hell of a piece of flying," he called out as he approached. "That was as smooth a dead-stick landing as I've ever seen." Rodriguez nodded her thanks, still processing the events of the last hour. She walked around to inspect the damage to her aircraft, and what she saw made her realize how close she'd come to not making it home at all. The right engine was clearly destroyed, with large sections of the intake and nacelle missing entirely. Scorch marks extended well beyond the engine bay, and she could see where pieces of the failed turbine had punctured the fuselage. As the maintenance crews began their initial inspection of the aircraft, Rodriguez noticed something that made her pause. The F-16 pilots who had escorted her were standing near the tail of the A-10, talking in hushed tones. Their conversation had taken on a different quality, more subdued and serious than the usual post-flight banter. She walked closer to see what had captured their attention, but before she could get near enough to hear their conversation clearly, Major Harrison approached her. "Captain Rodriguez, we need to talk to you about your aircraft," he said, his tone unusually formal. "There's something about that tail number that you need to know." Rodriguez looked back at the tail of her aircraft, where the number 80-0200 was clearly visible in black lettering against the gray paint. It was just a number to her, one of hundreds of A-10s in the Air Force inventory. But the expressions on the F-16 pilots' faces told her that this particular number meant something significant. The maintenance chief, a grizzled technical sergeant with 20 years of experience, had overheard the conversation. He walked over to join the group, glancing up at the tail number with a knowing look. "Sir," he addressed Major Harrison, "if that's the aircraft I think it is, this bird has quite a history. That tail number was involved in some pretty significant action overseas." Rodriguez felt a chill despite the desert heat. She'd been flying this particular aircraft for months, but she'd never paid attention to its history. In the military, aircraft were transferred between squadrons regularly, and pilots rarely knew the full service record of their assigned aircraft. "What kind of history?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The maintenance sergeant looked uncomfortable, glancing between the officers before speaking. "Ma'am, I'd rather let someone with more authority brief you on the details, but I will say that aircraft has seen more combat than most, and it's got a reputation that follows it wherever it goes." As if summoned by the conversation, a staff car pulled up to the flight line. Its government plates and official markings indicating that whoever was inside held significant authority. Rodriguez watched as a full colonel stepped out of the vehicle, his flight suit bearing the wings of a command pilot and enough ribbons to suggest extensive combat experience. "Colonel Marcus Webb," he introduced himself as he approached the group. "I'm the wing commander here at Nellis. I came out personally because of the aircraft involved in this emergency." Webb's eyes moved to the tail number of the A-10, and Rodriguez saw the same reaction that the F-16 pilots had shown: recognition, followed by something that looked almost like reverence. "Captain Rodriguez, I understand you've been flying this aircraft for several months?" "Yes, sir. It was assigned to me when I transferred to the 355th at Davis-Monthan. I've put about 200 hours on it since then." Colonel Webb nodded slowly. "And in all that time, no one briefed you on the history of tail number 80-0200? "No, sir. Should they have?" The colonel was quiet for a moment, looking up at the damaged aircraft as if seeing it for the first time. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flight line, and the emergency vehicles were beginning to disperse now that the immediate danger had passed. "Captain, the aircraft you just brought home safely isn't just any A-10. This particular Warthog has a combat record that most pilots would find hard to believe. It's been shot down, rebuilt, and returned to service more times than any other A-10 in the Air Force inventory." Rodriguez felt her stomach tighten. She'd always known that many of the A-10s still in service had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan, but the colonel's tone suggested something far more significant than routine deployment experience. "How many times, sir?" "3 times, Webb replied quietly. "And every time, the pilot survived to tell about it. The maintenance crews started calling it the Phoenix because it kept coming back from situations where it should have been lost forever." The F-16 pilots who had escorted her were listening intently to the conversation, and Rodriguez noticed that other maintenance personnel had begun gathering around, drawn by the unusual nature of the discussion. Word was spreading across the flight line that something significant was happening. "The first time was in Iraq in 2003, Colonel Webb continued. "The pilot took multiple surface-to-air missile hits while providing close air support during the initial invasion. He managed to nurse it back to a forward airstrip with one engine gone and hydraulic failure. The damage assessment said the aircraft should have been written off, but the maintenance crews worked around the clock to get it flying again." Rodriguez was beginning to understand why the other pilots had reacted so strongly to seeing the tail number. In military aviation, certain aircraft acquired reputations based on their service history, and it sounded like 80-0200 had built quite a legend for itself. The colonel gestured toward the damaged right engine. "Today's engine failure is just the latest chapter in a very long story, and based on what I saw of your landing, that story isn't over yet." As the maintenance crews continued their inspection of the aircraft, Rodriguez found herself looking at it with new eyes. The gray paint and worn surfaces that she'd taken for granted now seemed to tell a story of survival and determination that went far beyond her own emergency landing. But even as Colonel Webb filled in some of the details about the aircraft's history, Rodriguez sensed that he was holding back. There was more to the story of tail number 80-0200, something that would explain why the sight of those numbers had made experienced fighter pilots stop talking in mid-conversation. The desert sun was beginning to set, casting the flight line in golden light as the day shift gave way to the night crew. Rodriguez realized that what had started as a routine training mission had turned into something much more significant, both for her own flying career and for her understanding of the aircraft she'd been privileged to fly. As they prepared to transport her back to Davis-Monthan, she took one last look at the damaged A-10 sitting on the Nellis flight line. Tomorrow, the maintenance crews would begin the process of determining whether the aircraft could be repaired and returned to service once again. Based on its history, she had a feeling that 80-0200 would find a way to fly again, just as it had after every previous disaster. The Phoenix, indeed. 3 days after the emergency landing at Nellis, Captain Sarah Rodriguez found herself sitting in the squadron briefing room at Davis-Monthan, staring at a thick folder marked Classified Secret that had been placed on the table in front of her. Across from her sat Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, the squadron commander, and beside him was a civilian she hadn't met before. "Captain, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from the Air Force Historical Research Agency," Colonel Mitchell said by way of introduction. "She's here because of your aircraft, tail number 80-0200. Dr. Chen was a slight woman in her 50s with graying hair and intense eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She opened her own folder and pulled out a series of photographs, spreading them across the table like playing cards. Each photo showed the same A-10, but in different time periods and different states of damage. When Colonel Webb mentioned the aircraft's history, he only scratched the surface, Dr. Chen began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years researching military aviation history. Tail number 80-0200 isn't just any combat veteran. It's become something of a legend in A-10 circles, and your emergency landing has rekindled interest in its complete story. Rodriguez picked up one of the photographs, a black-and-white image showing an A-10 with extensive battle damage. Half of the left wing was missing. The vertical stabilizer was shot full of holes, and scorch marks covered most of the fuselage. Despite the damage, the aircraft was clearly on an airfield, having somehow made it home. This was taken in March 2003 at a forward operating base in Iraq, Dr. Chen explained. The pilot was Captain Mike Tombstone Sullivan. He was providing close air support for Marines advancing on Baghdad when he encountered heavy anti-aircraft fire. Rodriguez studied the photograph more closely. The damage was so extensive that she couldn't understand how the aircraft had remained flyable. The missing wing section alone should have made controlled flight impossible. "How did he get it home?" she asked. "That's where the story gets interesting," Dr. Chen continued. "Sullivan took multiple hits from 23mm anti-aircraft guns and at least 2 surface-to-air missiles. The first missile took out most of the left wing, and the second one hit the right engine, causing an immediate fire and complete power loss." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward, clearly familiar with the story, but still captivated by it. The A-10 was designed to take damage, but what Sullivan experienced went far beyond the design specifications. Dr. Chen pulled out another photograph, this one in color and clearly taken from a rescue helicopter. It showed the same aircraft in a steep, spiraling descent toward the desert floor, trailing smoke from multiple locations. "This photograph was taken by a search and rescue helicopter that happened to be in the area," she explained. "They were responding to another downed aircraft when they spotted Sullivan's A-10 in what appeared to be an unrecoverable spin." Rodriguez could see why the rescue crew would have assumed the aircraft was lost. The spin looked flat and fast. Exactly the kind of situation that A-10 pilots trained to avoid because recovery was considered nearly impossible with so much battle damage. But somehow he recovered it? "Not just recovered it," Dr. Chen said, producing another photograph. "He managed to regain control at less than 1,000 feet above the ground and flew it 70 miles back to the nearest friendly airfield." The next photograph showed the aircraft on the ground, surrounded by maintenance personnel and medical crews. Sullivan was visible standing next to the cockpit, his flight suit torn and blood-stained, but very much alive. The maintenance assessment afterward concluded that the aircraft should have been aerodynamically impossible to fly, Dr. Chen continued. The asymmetric damage from the missing wing section should have made it uncontrollable. But Sullivan managed to compensate using differential thrust from the remaining engine and careful manipulation of the flight controls. Rodriguez found herself thinking about her own emergency landing just days earlier. She'd lost both engines, but the aircraft itself had been structurally intact. What Sullivan had accomplished was in an entirely different category of airmanship. And this was just the first time it was shot down? "The first of 3. Colonel Mitchell confirmed. "Each time, the aircraft suffered what should have been fatal damage, and each time, the pilot managed to bring it home." Dr. Chen arranged the photographs chronologically, creating a visual timeline of the aircraft's combat history. The next series showed tail number 80-0200 in Afghanistan in 2010, once again heavily damaged, but somehow still flyable. The second incident occurred during Operation Enduring Freedom, Dr. Chen explained. The pilot was Major Lisa Reaper Thompson, one of the first female A-10 pilots to see extensive combat. The photographs from Afghanistan showed a different kind of damage, but no less severe. The aircraft's nose section was crumpled, the cockpit canopy was spider-webbed with cracks, and what appeared to be shrapnel holes peppered the entire fuselage. Thompson was supporting a convoy that had come under attack from Taliban fighters positioned in caves along a mountainside, Dr. Chen continued. She was making low-level strafing runs when she flew into a carefully prepared ambush. Rodriguez could see from the photographs that Thompson had faced a different tactical situation than Sullivan. Instead of the heavy anti-aircraft guns and missiles that characterized the Iraq War, the Afghanistan photos showed damage from small arms fire and rocket-propelled grenades. The Taliban fighters had set up a crossfire pattern using RPGs, Dr. Chen explained. They waited until Thompson was committed to her attack run, then fired simultaneously from multiple positions. She took 7 direct RPG hits in the space of about 3 seconds. The next photograph showed the moment of impact, captured by a drone that had been providing surveillance for the convoy. Rodriguez could see the bright flashes of the RPG explosions against the aircraft's dark silhouette, and trails of smoke and debris streaming behind it. 7 RPG hits, Rodriguez repeated, trying to imagine surviving such an onslaught. How is that even possible? The A-10's titanium bathtub around the cockpit saved her life, Colonel Mitchell explained. But the damage to the aircraft was extensive. She lost all hydraulic pressure, most of her electrical systems, and the GAU-8 cannon was completely destroyed. Dr. Chen showed her the next photograph in the sequence, taken from the ground by one of the soldiers in the convoy. The A-10 was visible in the distance, flying at an extremely low altitude, with pieces falling off it as it struggled to remain airborne. Thompson managed to maintain control using manual reversion mode, flying the aircraft purely through physical strength and mechanical linkages, Dr. Chen explained. She flew at 40 miles back to Bagram Airfield, landing with no hydraulics, no electrical power, and a cracked canopy that was barely holding together. The final photograph in the Afghanistan series showed Thompson climbing out of the cockpit, assisted by ground crew members. Even from a distance, Rodriguez could see that the pilot was injured, but she was alive and moving under her own power. Both Sullivan and Thompson received distinguished flying crosses for their actions, Colonel Mitchell noted. But more importantly, from an institutional perspective, their experiences provided invaluable data about the A-10's survivability under extreme conditions. Rodriguez was beginning to understand why the aircraft had acquired such a reputation, but she still didn't fully grasp why the F-16 pilots at Nellis had reacted so strongly to seeing the tail number. There had to be more to the story. "You mentioned 3 incidents," she prompted. Dr. Chen's expression became more serious, and she exchanged a glance with Colonel Mitchell before continuing. "The 3rd incident is different from the first 2. It occurred just 18 months ago, during the final stages of Operation Inherent Resolve in Syria." She produced a new set of photographs, these clearly more recent based on the digital image quality and color saturation. The aircraft was recognizable as 80 Oro 200, but the damage pattern was unlike anything Rodriguez had seen in the previous photos. "The pilot was Captain David Ghost Martinez," Dr. Chen began. "He was part of a close air support mission supporting Special Operations Forces who had come under attack from a much larger enemy force." The photographs showed an aircraft that looked like it had been through a meat grinder. The entire left side of the fuselage was blackened and torn, both engines showed obvious damage, and the vertical stabilizer was barely attached to the airframe. Martinez took a direct hit from a surface-to-air missile while making a gun run to support the ground forces, Dr. Chen continued. "But this wasn't a shoulder-fired missile like a Stinger. This was a larger radar-guided system that the enemy wasn't supposed to have." Rodriguez examined the photos more closely. The missile damage was concentrated around the left engine and wing root, but secondary damage extended throughout the aircraft. She could see where the explosion had blown panels off the fuselage and damaged control surfaces. The missile detonation destroyed the left engine completely and caused immediate hydraulic failure, Dr. Chen explained. But Martinez also lost most of his flight control surfaces on the left side of the aircraft. The next photograph was taken from a KC-135 tanker aircraft that had been orbiting overhead. It showed 80 Baozhou 200 in what appeared to be an uncontrolled descent, with pieces streaming away from the aircraft as it fell toward the Syrian desert. The special ops team on the ground reported seeing the A-10 go down in flames, Dr. Chen continued. They assumed Martinez was lost and called for search and rescue to recover his body. Rodriguez could understand that assumption. The aircraft in the photographs looked completely unflyable, more like wreckage than an operational aircraft. But Martinez didn't go down. He managed to regain partial control using differential thrust from the remaining engine and what was left of his flight controls, Dr. Chen explained. But he was losing altitude and couldn't maintain level flight. The next photograph showed the aircraft at an extremely low altitude, flying just above the desert floor. Smoke was streaming from multiple locations, and the aircraft's flight path was clearly erratic. Martinez realized he couldn't make it back to a friendly airfield, Dr. Chen continued. But he also knew that the special ops team was still under heavy fire and needed close air support to survive. Rodriguez felt a chill as she realized what Dr. Chen was suggesting. He continued the mission. For the next 20 minutes, Martinez flew that aircraft in conditions that should have been impossible, Dr. Chen confirmed. He made multiple gun runs against enemy positions, providing the close air support that allowed the Special Operations team to break contact and reach their extraction point. The photographs from the ground showed the impossible sight of a heavily damaged A-10 making repeated attack runs while trailing smoke and debris. In one image, Rodriguez could see muzzle flashes from the GAU-8 cannon as Martinez engaged enemy positions. The Special Ops team later reported that Martinez's continued presence overhead was the only thing that kept them alive, Colonel Mitchell added. Without his fire support, they would have been overrun. Dr. Chen produced the final photograph in the series, taken after Martinez had finally been forced to attempt an emergency landing. The aircraft was on the ground in the Syrian desert, but it was clearly a controlled landing rather than a crash. Martinez put it down on a stretch of flat desert about 15 miles from the original battle site, Dr. Chen explained. The aircraft was a total loss, but he walked away from it. Rodriguez studied the photograph of the crashed aircraft. Even on the ground, the extent of the damage was remarkable. She couldn't understand how it had remained flyable long enough for Martinez to complete his mission. This is where the story becomes even more unusual, Dr. Chen continued. When the recovery team reached the crash site to extract Martinez and secure any sensitive equipment, they made an unexpected discovery. She produced one final photograph. This one, taken inside the cockpit of the crashed aircraft. Rodriguez could see the instrument panel, most of which had been destroyed or damaged beyond recognition, but what caught her attention was something mounted on the side console that shouldn't have been there. "Is that a camera?" Rodriguez asked. "A specially modified recording system," Dr. Chen confirmed. Unknown to Martinez or any of the previous pilots, the aircraft had been equipped with experimental equipment to record pilot actions and aircraft performance during combat situations. Colonel Mitchell leaned forward. "The data from that recorder has revolutionized our understanding of what's possible in terms of aircraft survivability and pilot performance under extreme conditions." Rodriguez was beginning to see the bigger picture. The aircraft hadn't just been lucky enough to survive 3 catastrophic incidents. It had been deliberately selected as a test platform to study survivability, and the data collected from its combat experiences had been invaluable to aircraft designers and pilot training programs. "But there's something else," Dr. Chen continued, her voice taking on an even more serious tone. "Something that wasn't discovered until after Martinez's mission. She pulled out a maintenance record, thick with technical data and analysis reports. When the aircraft was recovered from Syria and brought back for detailed examination, the maintenance crews made a startling discovery about the extent of the damage. Rodriguez waited, sensing that whatever she was about to learn would explain the reaction of the F-16 pilots at Nellis. The structural damage from all 3 combat incidents had never been completely repaired, Dr. Chen explained. Each time the aircraft was rebuilt and returned to service, some of the battle damage was left in place, either because it wasn't considered critical or because repair would have been too expensive. The implications hit Rodriguez immediately. You mean I've been flying an aircraft that was still carrying damage from previous combat? Not just damage, Colonel Mitchell said quietly. When your aircraft was examined at Nellis after the engine failure, the maintenance crews found evidence of all 3 previous incidents. Patched holes from Sullivan's mission in Iraq, reinforcement plates from Thompson's experience in Afghanistan, and structural modifications from Martinez's final flight in Syria. Dr. Chen produced a detailed maintenance diagram showing the cumulative damage and repairs. The aircraft was essentially a flying museum of combat survivability, with each mission adding to its legacy of battle damage and miraculous survival. The F-16 pilots at Nellis knew this history, Colonel Mitchell continued. When they saw the tail number, they realized they were escorting one of the most famous combat aircraft in the Air Force inventory. Rodriguez looked again at the photographs spread across the table. Each image told a story of survival against impossible odds, and she realized that her own emergency landing had simply added another chapter to the legend of tail number 80-0200. So when my engines failed, you were flying an aircraft that had already proven its ability to survive the impossible 3 times over, Dr. Chen confirmed. And based on your successful dead-stick landing, it appears that reputation is still well-deserved. As Rodriguez absorbed this information, she realized that her perspective on her emergency landing was completely changed. She'd thought she was dealing with a routine mechanical failure, but in reality, she'd been continuing a tradition of survival that stretched back over 2 decades of combat operations. The briefing was interrupted by a knock on the door. A senior master sergeant entered and handed Colonel Mitchell a message. "Captain Rodriguez," the colonel said after reading the message, "you might be interested to know that the maintenance crews at Nellis have completed their assessment of your aircraft." Rodriguez waited, wondering if tail number 80-0200 would once again live up to its reputation for survival. "They're recommending that the aircraft be repaired and returned to service," Colonel Mitchell announced. "Apparently, despite the engine failure and emergency landing, the basic airframe is still structurally sound." Dr. Chen smiled. "It seems the Phoenix is ready to rise again." 6 weeks after the emergency landing at Nellis Air Force Base, Captain Sarah Rodriguez stood on the flight line at Davis-Monthan, watching as tail number 80-0200 was towed out of the maintenance hangar. The aircraft looked almost identical to the way it had before the engine failure, but she now knew that its pristine appearance concealed a history that few military aircraft could match. The morning briefing had been unusual. Instead of the standard mission planning session, Colonel Mitchell had called together the entire squadron to witness what he called a historic moment in A-10 operations. Word had spread throughout the base that something significant was happening, and Rodriguez noticed several senior officers and civilian personnel she didn't recognize gathered near the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Mitchell announced to the assembled crowd, "today we're not just returning an aircraft to service. We're continuing a story that began more than 20 years ago and has become legend in the close air support community." Rodriguez felt a mix of pride and nervousness as she realized she was about to become part of that legend. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of interviews, debriefings, and media attention as word of the aircraft's history had spread throughout the military aviation community. She'd received congratulatory messages from pilots around the world, including personal notes from Mike Sullivan, Lisa Thompson, and David Martinez, the 3 pilots who had previously brought 80-200 home from impossible situations. Dr. Chen approached Rodriguez, carrying a thick folder that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Captain, I thought you might be interested in the final chapter of our research into your aircraft's history." Rodriguez accepted the folder, noting that it was significantly thicker than the classified materials she'd reviewed during her initial briefing. "What did you find?" "Something that even we didn't know when we first met," Dr. Chen replied. "It turns out that tail number 80 Mairo 200 has had an influence on military aviation that extends far beyond its own combat record." She opened the folder to reveal technical drawings, test reports, and design modifications that had been incorporated into A-10 aircraft based on data collected from 80 Mairo 200's combat experiences. The experimental recording equipment that had been secretly installed in the aircraft had provided engineers with unprecedented data about how aircraft systems performed under extreme combat conditions. Every A-10 built since 2005 has incorporated design improvements that were developed directly from analyzing your aircraft's performance during its 3 combat losses, Dr. Chen explained. The titanium bathtub was strengthened, the hydraulic systems were redesigned for better redundancy, and the engine mounting system was modified to better survive missile impacts. Rodriguez scanned the technical documents, amazed at the level of detail that had been extracted from the aircraft's combat experiences. There were stress analysis reports showing how the airframe had flexed under battle damage, performance curves demonstrating how pilots had compensated for damaged flight controls, and even psychological studies analyzing pilot decision-making under extreme stress. "But there's more," Dr. Chen continued. "The data from 80 O200 was also used to develop new training programs for A-10 pilots. The emergency procedures you learned during your pilot training were refined based on the techniques that Sullivan, Thompson, and Martinez used to survive their respective encounters." The implications were staggering. Rodriguez realized that her own successful emergency landing had been possible, in part because previous pilots flying the same aircraft had proven what was possible and helped develop the training that had prepared her for the situation. A commotion near the aircraft drew their attention. A convoy of vehicles had arrived, and Rodriguez recognized several high-ranking officers getting out of the lead car. Among them was General Patricia Hayes, the commander of Air Combat Command, whose presence indicated that this aircraft return ceremony was considered significant at the highest levels of the Air Force. "Captain Rodriguez," General Hayes approached with her entourage, including several colonels and a civilian who appeared to be from the Pentagon. "I wanted to personally thank you for your handling of the emergency situation last month. Your actions have added another chapter to one of our most remarkable aircraft stories." Rodriguez came to attention and saluted. "Thank you, General. I was just doing my job." "Your job, perhaps, but your execution was exemplary," the general replied. "I understand you've been briefed on the history of this particular aircraft?" "Yes, ma'am. It's been quite an education." General Hayes gestured toward the aircraft, which was now being prepared for its return flight. "What you may not know is that this aircraft has become something of a symbol throughout the Air Force. The maintenance personnel who've worked on it over the years have started referring to it as Old Reliable, and its reputation has spread to other services as well." The Pentagon civilian stepped forward, introducing himself as Dr. Robert Sterling, the Deputy Director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. "Captain, the data we've collected from this aircraft over the years has contributed to developments in multiple defense programs. The insights into pilot performance under extreme stress have influenced everything from cockpit design to pilot selection criteria." Rodriguez was beginning to understand that her emergency landing had been more than just a personal survival story. It had been another data point in a decades-long research program that was influencing the future of military aviation. "Which brings us to why we're all here today," General Hayes continued. The Air Force has decided that tail number 80-200 deserves special recognition for its unique contribution to our understanding of aircraft survivability and pilot performance. She nodded to Colonel Mitchell, who stepped forward with a ceremonial plaque that Rodriguez hadn't noticed before. The bronze plaque bore the image of an A-10 and was engraved with text that read, A-10A 80-0200 Phoenix, in recognition of extraordinary service to the United States Air Force and invaluable contribution to aviation safety and survivability research. This aircraft is being officially designated as a heritage aircraft, General Hayes announced. It will continue in operational service, but it will also serve as a living memorial to the pilots who've flown it and the ground personnel who've kept it flying against all odds. As the ceremony continued, Rodriguez found herself thinking about the weight of responsibility that came with flying such a historically significant aircraft. Every pilot who climbed into the cockpit of 80-0200 would be continuing a story that had already inspired changes throughout military aviation. Master Sergeant Robert Kim, the maintenance chief responsible for the aircraft's restoration, approached Rodriguez during a break in the formal proceedings. "Captain, I thought you might like to know about some of the things we found during the rebuild." Kim was a 20-year veteran who had worked on A-10s throughout his career. But Rodriguez could see that this particular aircraft held special significance for him as well. "We documented everything this time," Kim continued. "Every patch, every reinforcement, every modification that's been made over the years. It's like an archaeological dig, except instead of pottery fragments, we're uncovering layers of combat history." He led Rodriguez around to the aircraft's tail section, pointing out areas where previous battle damage had been repaired. "You can see the patches from Captain Sullivan's mission here, where the 23mm rounds went through the vertical stabilizer, and these reinforcement plates were added after Major Thompson's encounter with the RPGs." Rodriguez could see the subtle differences in paint color and metal texture that revealed the aircraft's history. What had once appeared to be normal wear and tear now told the story of survival and resilience that spanned multiple conflicts. "The most interesting discovery was in the cockpit," Kim continued. "When we pulled the panels for the engine replacement, we found something that none of the previous maintenance crews had documented." He showed Rodriguez a small metal plate that had been mounted inside the cockpit, hidden behind one of the instrument panels. Engraved on the plate were 4 names: Sullivan, Thompson, Martinez, and now Rodriguez, along with the dates of their respective emergency situations. "We think Captain Martinez added the plate after his mission in Syria," Kim explained. "It looks like he wanted to create a permanent record of everyone who'd brought this bird home against the odds." Rodriguez was moved by the gesture. The hidden plaque represented a brotherhood of pilots who had faced the ultimate test and succeeded, bound together by their shared experience with the same aircraft. The formal ceremony concluded with Rodriguez climbing back into the cockpit of 80-200 for its return flight. As she strapped in and began her pre-flight checks, she noticed that the maintenance crews had made one addition to the cockpit that wasn't part of the standard A-10 configuration. A small placard had been mounted on the instrument panel where it would be visible to every pilot who flew the aircraft. It read simply, "Phoenix Rising, never give up." The engines started normally, their familiar whine filling the cockpit as Rodriguez prepared to taxi. But as she released the brakes and began moving toward the runway, she felt a connection to the aircraft that went beyond the normal pilot-aircraft relationship. "Davis Mountain Tower, Hog 67 requesting taxi clearance for local training flight," she called over the radio. "Hog 67, cleared to taxi runway 12 left. Wind calm, visibility unlimited. Welcome back, Phoenix." As Rodriguez lifted off from Davis Mountain and climbed into the Arizona sky, she reflected on how much had changed since her emergency landing at Nellis. She was no longer just another A-10 pilot. She was the latest guardian of a living piece of aviation history. The training mission proceeded normally, with none of the drama that had characterized her previous flight in 80-200. But Rodriguez found herself paying closer attention to every system, every indication, every subtle change in the aircraft's performance. She was acutely aware that she was responsible not just for completing the mission safely, but for preserving the legacy of an aircraft that had already proven its worth beyond any reasonable doubt. During the flight, she received a radio call that surprised her. "Hog 6-7, this is Viper 1-1. Request permission to join up for a formation flight." Rodriguez looked out her left window and spotted two F-16s climbing up to her altitude. She recognized the call sign as belonging to Major Harrison, one of the pilots who had escorted her during the emergency landing. "Viper 1-1, you're cleared to join. What's the occasion?" "Just wanted to see the Phoenix back in the air," Harrison replied as his F-16 slid into formation alongside the A-10. "Word gets around when a legend returns to service." The three aircraft flew in formation for several minutes, a symbolic representation of the brotherhood that existed among military pilots regardless of the aircraft they flew. Harrison's gesture was his way of acknowledging the significance of 80-200's return to operational status. After the F-16s departed to return to their base, Rodriguez continued her training mission, practicing the same close air support techniques that Sullivan, Thompson, and Martinez had used in combat. She found herself thinking about the responsibility that came with being the current pilot of such a historic aircraft. As she prepared to return to Davis-Monthan, Rodriguez realized that her emergency landing had been more than just a test of her piloting skills. It had been an initiation into a select group of aviators who had proven that the combination of superior training, advanced aircraft design, and sheer determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The landing back at Davis-Monthan was smooth and uneventful, exactly the kind of routine operation that most military flights should be. As Rodriguez taxied back to the flight line, she could see that a crowd had gathered to welcome the Phoenix home. Among the gathered personnel, she spotted Dr. Chen, who had remained at the base to witness the aircraft's return flight. As Rodriguez shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, Dr. Chen approached with a smile. "How did it feel to fly her again?" Dr. Chen asked. Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "It felt like coming home," she replied, "but also like accepting a responsibility that's bigger than just one pilot or one mission." Dr. Chen nodded, understanding. "That's exactly how Sullivan described it when I interviewed him last week. He said that flying 80-200 wasn't just about operating an aircraft. It was about continuing a story that had meaning for everyone in the A-10 community." As the post-flight debriefing concluded and the aircraft was secured for the night, Rodriguez found herself looking forward to the next mission. She knew that every flight in 80-200 would be special, not because of any supernatural qualities attributed to the aircraft, but because of the human stories of courage and skill that had made it famous. The Phoenix had risen once again, ready to continue serving and perhaps to add new chapters to its already remarkable story. And Rodriguez was proud to be the pilot entrusted with writing those new chapters, knowing that she was part of a legacy that would inspire military aviators for generations to come. That evening, as Rodriguez completed her mission reports, she received an email from Captain David Martinez, the pilot who had performed the final combat mission in Syria. The message was brief but meaningful. "Welcome to the Phoenix Club. You're now part of something special that goes beyond just flying. Take care of the old bird, and she'll take care of you. The legend continues." Rodriguez saved the email and added it to the growing collection of correspondence she'd received from pilots around the world who had heard the story of tale number 80-200. Each message reinforced her understanding that she was now the custodian of more than just an aircraft. She was the keeper of a story that embodied the best traditions of military aviation. As she prepared to leave the squadron that evening, Rodriguez took one last look at 80-200 sitting on the flight line under the floodlights. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to add to the aircraft's legacy. The Phoenix was ready to fly again, and Captain Sarah Rodriguez was honored to be the pilot who would carry its story into the future.